Since the end of World War II, the United States has destabilized dozens of countries and overthrown their elected governments. Just how many countries is uncertain. In Iran in 1953, the Eisenhower administration joined forces with British intelligence to overthrow the government of Iran, which was seeking a larger share of its country's oil revenues. Britain began pumping oil in Iran in 1908, had installed a fictitious monarchy to guard their profits. The stated view of Britain had been, in their own words, why should they be concerned with a nation of 7 million lazy, dusty ragamuffins? The British imposed monarchy was overthrown by Mohammad Mossadegh, who then sought more than the 5 to 15% share of domestic oil revenues that they were allotted. Allen Dulles and Kermit Roosevelt, the son of FDR, were able to direct Iranian army officers in a coup to overthrow Mossadegh, the elected government, and install the fictitious monarchy of the Shah again. The Shah immediately granted British Petroleum a 40% share of the oil concession, and American firms received 40% as a reward for their participation. The overthrow of Mossadegh emboldened the CIA and became a blueprint for future destabilization operations. Mossadegh represented the legitimate aspirations of a nationalist democracy that was thwarted in the name of anti-communism. The resulting chaos and radicalization of Iran are a direct result of interference in the internal affairs of that nation, what is referred to as blowback, the unintended negative consequences of covert actions against foreign elected governments. The Shah was described in a confidential CIA report as a sociopath who suffered from a dominating father and a sense of the illegitimacy of his mandate to rule. Savak is perhaps the most feared term in Iran. It is the name of the Shah's secret police agency that was set up with the help of the CIA. One American archaeologist who worked with an Iranian female student found that she was missing and reportedly arrested by agents of Savak. Her political affiliations with an opposition party had brought her to their attention. Even though these actions amounted to the same thing as an American college student joining the Democratic Party or other loyal opposition party, he was later informed that she had been interrogated, tortured, raped, and then executed. This occurred to thousands of students, professionals, and loyal opposition members who criticized or opposed the Shah's regime. When publicly informed about these actions of his government by journalists, the Shah was sanguine and considered it the price of stability. The excesses of the American selected and trained Savak, as well as the unequal distribution of wealth, directly led to the emergence of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution that resulted in the kidnapping of personnel in the American embassy and a hostile regime that views the U.S. as a force for evil in the world, hence the litany of referring to the United States as the Great Satan. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA accepted and carried out a proposal from United Brands, the company also known as Chiquita Banana, to overthrow the Guatemalan government, which was the only democratically elected government Guatemala had ever had. Chiquita and the CIA replaced that government with 30 years plus, and still counting, of bloodshed under a series of almost barbaric right-wing dictators. The U.S. taxpayers continue to fund these regimes under the recurrent threat that if they do not, the Guatemalan people will fall prey to the evils of communism. In Guatemala, a mere 2% of the population owned 72% of the land. 90% of landowners were confined to the poorest 15% of the land. United Brands owned the railroads, the major port, and vast tracts of some of the most productive agricultural land on earth. President Arbenz had won the election with 65% of the vote in 1950. He tried to fulfill his mandate, which was land reform, minimum wage, and other extravagances modeled on FDR's efforts in the U.S. He seized the largest land holdings and distributed the 1.5 million acres to 100,000 families, including confiscating his own family's land holdings. The land was paid for with 25-year interest-bearing notes. This was perfectly within the guidelines of Kennedy-era Alliance for Progress program or other U.S. programs in El Salvador and Chile, the only difference being the investment by United Brands and the political influence they could bring to bear on the Arbenz government. The U.S. Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower was John Foster Dulles, a partner of the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. He had personally handled the purchase of the Central American railroads for United Brands. Both John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, had represented the wealthy Guatemalan landowners as well as United Brands and other powerful economic interests in Guatemala. Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles orchestrated a campaign to paint the Arbenz government as communist or red and launched a mercenary war from Honduras. John Moore's Cabot attacked from the State Department, Henry Cabot Lodge attacked from the UN, and Eisenhower's personal secretary lobbied him for her husband, who was the public relations director for United Brands. All of these people in the U.S. government were invested in the status quo in Guatemala, either as attorneys, investment bankers, or stockholders. Arbenz tried to buy weapons on the open market to defend himself, but the shipment was captured and held up as proof that he was communist or red. The U.S.-backed mercenary army invaded Guatemala in force, but was about to be defeated when CIA pilots intervened and turned the tide of battle. Arbenz fled to Mexico, and United Brands and CIA representatives in Guatemala handpicked an unknown, Carlos Castillas Armas. The bloodletting among the peasant population eventually numbered several 100,000, and at times took on the character of a genocidal war carried out by forces trained, equipped, and supervised by the United States. In 1979, 90% of the farmers continued to own 16% of the land, an eternal source of revolution that will have to continually be crushed with the help of the U.S. taxpayer. In 1966, a swell of revolution brought a full-scale U.S.-sponsored counterinsurgency response program to Guatemala, including arms, advisors, and even Green Berets. A State Department study analyzed the program years later and stated, quote, "To eliminate a few hundred guerrillas, the government killed perhaps 10,000 Guatemalan peasants," unquote. Father Ronald Hennessy wrote of one event among many. July 14, 1982, the local military commander sent word for all the people of the aldea of Pentinac to be assembled for his arrival at 11 o'clock. At 4 p.m., all of the men, with hands tied behind their backs, were escorted by the soldiers to one house, shot, stabbed, and piled one on top of the other, and covered with burnable items of the very house, which were sprinkled with gasoline and set on fire. The women were treated the same as the men, differing only that some had live babies on their backs when they were stacked for burning. The other children were tied one to another and pulled alive into the flames of a third house by the soldiers. In September of 1981, an association of Guatemalan coroners complained that they couldn't keep up with the demand for autopsies because the number of violent deaths had increased so rapidly, 50% higher each month than the last. Michael Deaver, who was instrumental in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and one of his three closest advisors, along with Edwin Meese and James Baker. His public relations firm, Deaver and Hannaford, took on various right-wing Central and South American landowners and businessmen as clients, among them a contingent of Guatemalans.
Was not a Guatemalan government. It was a foreign government controlled by foreigners. Controlled